My name is Elena Ionescu, and I'm the Director of Sustainability at the Specialty Coffee Association of America. I'm a comparative newcomer to conversations about labor and farm workers, despite spending the better part of a decade visiting coffee farms in Latin America and Africa as a green buyer for a mid-sized roasting company. I seldom spoke to coffee farm workers, and when I did, it was typically to ask if I could take their picture. And this is not something that I'm proud of, per se, but I don't think I'm especially unusual either. So Christina makes a compelling case for understanding modern slavery and what this loaded term means to coffee. Issues of underpayment and non-payment are as old as agriculture. And coffee is not alone, as she mentioned, in struggling to understand what our accountability is in a changing landscape. In some places, including coffee-consuming countries like the UK, and coffee-producing and consuming countries like Brazil, this change is being driven by broad government policy. But everywhere coffee is consumed, it's a highly recognizable, highly visible symbol of international trade. And that puts us at the forefront of conversations about accountability, ethics, globalization, in a way that, for example, blueberries are unlikely to be featured. Compliance is non-negotiable, not only for the legal ramifications of non-compliance, but also for the brand risk it represents to a company or to the brand of coffee. So coffee farmers globally are all in a similar position. And while images like this one may suggest that consumers would demand better supply chain accountability from us, like many, I suspect that a smear campaign would do less to affect real transformation than to lead to temporary solutions and supplier reshuffling. So if not this, then what would affect that real transformation in our community? Well, what about, as Chad suggests, a threat to the availability of coffee? If you're like me, you know maybe a little bit about legal issues, but a lot about coffee. And that's really at the heart of the argument that I aim to make here today, that we should begin to see and engage with coffee farm workers, because labor scarcity represents a bigger threat in the short term to the quality and availability of our coffee than any other issue, including climate change. So I made a similar case at RICO in Atlanta 2 months ago, and I used the labor scarcity in Nicaragua as the basis for my presentation. I traveled to Nicaragua in January of this year, and the situation that I found was reflected by this headline, which comes from Nicaragua's largest national daily newspaper. The headline roughly translates as "Coffee falls off the trees in the region of Nueva Segovia for lack of pickers," and the subheading suggests that workers are migrating to Honduras where the pay is better. But workers have been migrating from Nicaragua to pick coffee for years, so why is this news? Well, I wanted to find out. And hear this from the voices of coffee farmers and workers themselves. So I spent a week in Nicaragua interviewing farmers and workers about how the changing labor market is affecting them, and by extension, the quality and availability of coffee underpinning many of our supply chains. So let's listen.
Es muy difícil porque muchos jóvenes como que anterior le tenían más amor a lo que es el café, pero como que ahora casi como que no, ¿verdad? Unos cogen para otro o que se van para otro lado porque en otros lados pagan mejores. En Honduras dicen que están pagando bien y entonces se van para allá la gente.
No, mi mayoría de hijos que tengo los tengo en El Salvador trabajando. Ellos vienen cada año aquí. Yo solo vivo con mi esposa y tengo 3 hijos más, los más pequeños, y unas nietas que viven conmigo.
Yo aquí estoy temporal, vengo 3, 4 días y me regreso a mi casa. Mi marido es el que trabaja aquí, yo no.
¿Qué piensa que van a hacer?
Las dos están estudiando las dos y no pienso eso. Van a hacer en la vida otra cosa.
Algunos que tienen sus cafetales también pegados donde mí, lo mismo los están dejando que se enmonten, que se pierdan últimamente, porque no hayan mano de obra, ¿sí? Muchos cafetaleros están buscando otro rubro, porque creen que el café es muy barato y no es suficiente.
Una de las razones por las cuales pues, lo del cambio es precisamente por el tema de los precios, ¿no? Los precios, la caída de la bolsa, el tema del incremento también de los costos, ¿va? En campo, producto de la llegada de la roya, producto del cambio climático, de las sequías y todos esos asuntos que nos han afectado, pues obviamente pues, nos han hecho realizar ajustes para poder, o sea, seguirnos manteniendo sobre en el rubro. Definitivamente pues ha sido bien complicado, bien difícil, porque esto nos ha llevado a generar cambios en toda la cadena, digamos.
So let's review what we've heard. First, migration. People who, until recently, picked coffee are now leaving coffee and leaving the country. Whereas a decade ago, it was common to find Nicaraguans picking coffee in Costa Rica, now Honduras, which has invested heavily in the productivity of its coffee sector in recent years, is an attractive alternative for workers, especially getting paid by the volume that they pick and not by the hour. Even El Salvador, despite diminishing coffee volumes, offers payment in dollars. And the US dollar has strengthened significantly against the Nicaraguan Cordoba in recent years. Second is generational transition. Young people don't necessarily want to farm coffee, much less pick it, and their parents aren't fighting to keep them on the farm when they feel better options exist elsewhere. In 2015, for example, the total value of remittances to Nicaragua was 3 times the value of its coffee exports. Third, coffee rust. Guatemala's National Coffee Association, ANACAFE, estimates, based on reportings from across the region, that 18 million bags of coffee were lost between 2012 and 2015 to coffee rust in Central America. With farms experiencing shortfalls of between 30 and 80%, farmers were forced to cut back on the number of pickers they hired. Add that to the already seasonal, informal nature of much of coffee employment, and pickers were forced to seek employment elsewhere. And although productivity has recovered somewhat, workers have moved on. Now, Central American governments are not blind to the issues being caused by labor scarcity. In fact, in Guatemala, for example, the national minimum wage has risen by 55% in the past 8 years. And that should be good news for everyone. But is it? The New York C price was around $1.15 at the time of these interviews. And though it's risen since, it still doesn't touch the cost that many producers in Central America face to produce coffee, and especially high-quality coffee. Farmers may agree that workers need higher wages, but how can they afford to pay more when studies from across Latin America show that labor comprises roughly 50%, and sometimes, as demonstrated by this graph from ICAFE in Costa Rica, an even greater share of the cost of production for coffee harvested by hand? So it's been bleak so far. But despite the challenges, I am actually optimistic about specialty coffee in Central America. And one of the reasons why is that our lack of recognition of this issue heretofore means that, I can see some pretty low-hanging fruit, and I also see a will to address it. So after I presented at RICO in Atlanta, I was approached by buyers representing companies large and small with the same question: what should I be doing? So Christina has presented us with tools and strategies to help us understand our legal obligations. But that's not where most of us are going to be the most comfortable. Sure, some of you may get really into the different policies and programs being enacted by ministries of labor in the countries where you source your coffee. But it's an unrealistic obligation to have of all of us, at least at the moment. What we can do, though, is to begin to ask questions within our supply chains. Traceability is fundamental. So if you're not at the point yet of knowing the farms from which you're buying your coffee, start there. Work with your importers, call some exporters, determine the obstacles to establishing a chain of custody, and analyze the costs. If you know the farms that you're sourcing coffee from, you may be in the position to begin asking questions of farm owners. Questions like, are workers housed on site? And does the farm keep records of all the hours worked by employees throughout the harvest season? I suggest treading lightly, because these questions may feel like an imposition to farm owners. And it will be important to communicate and also for us to remember ourselves that we're not asking these questions in order to reveal and punish offenses, but rather to identify risks and work to address them together. Legally and reputationally, risk is shared, and we are no longer protected by what we don't know. On the flip side, though, when it comes to securing future volume of coffee, value is also shared. And you may even find, after broaching this subject and suffering through the initial awkwardness, that farmers are glad for the opportunity to talk about an issue that many of them have struggled with for years in silence. Beyond farm owners, we should even begin to think about talking directly to farm workers, though this is probably going to be the most difficult because the largest linguistic and cultural distance separates our two groups. Thankfully, though, we don't have to do this alone. There are individuals, institutions, and organizations that are eager to help us with this work. One of those resources just left the stage a few minutes ago, but there are a couple of others that I'd like to mention. So the Ethical Trading Initiative hosts trainings for companies, including one entitled Worker Voice and Representation, and another Buying Ethically, a workshop for buyers. Their reach extends beyond coffee and also into it, as a few companies who are present in this room can attest. Second, US-based United Farm Workers has been conducting a pilot project at La Revancha, one of the farms where I conducted interviews, since 2014. And during that time, they've also been spending time with industry in the United States, buyers of that coffee, in order to not only have their work benefit farm workers, but also the entire supply chain. Jamie Padilla, who runs that project for UFW, recently reminded me that it took her time and energy to understand the cues for quality that many of us take for granted on farms, things like elevation and variety and ripeness. But she believes that understanding these have helped enhance the work that she does on behalf of farm workers. We have a similar opportunity to learn to see farms differently, and I believe that it will enhance the work that we do. We might also be surprised by what we find once we begin asking these questions. I was surprised when I saw this graph in April, which comes from a survey done by the Colombian Coffee Federation of workers across Colombia. The priorities here show that food is more important than, say, the proximity of a farm to a worker's home. And I was surprised by that. But I probably shouldn't have been, because when I went back after seeing this graph and reviewed these interviews I'd conducted in January, I found that the priorities of Nicaraguan farm workers pretty much exactly reflected those of Colombian coffee farm workers. I just wasn't listening for it. But here.
¿Y por qué decidió venir a cortar café aquí?
Es por lo que, digamos, son buenos las fincas para trabajar uno aquí y lo apoyan a uno en tiempo de corte.
¿Y en qué sentido? ¿De qué consiste el apoyo?
En el bono que le dan a los, ayuda a los cortadores. Y en el salario que es puntual.
Siempre nos ha gustado venir aquí porque la comida, pues, ¿verdad? Es más tremenda que en otros lugares, porque también hay patrones que se descuidan mucho de los trabajadores, le dan un maltrato en la comida, en la dormida, que eso es lo primordial que tienen que tener las haciendas cafetaleras, que tengan un buen mantenimiento para el trabajador también, porque hay haciendas que al trabajador lo miran como cualquier cosa, como animal, pues, más que todo, ¿verdad? Y nosotros, bueno, sabemos que en esta hacienda pues hay un mantenimiento pues, para los trabajadores, una comida aseadita, bastante también, ¿verdad? Entonces, por eso nos gusta venir aquí.
Aquí son mejores condiciones, aquí están buenas las cosechas, eso es bueno estar aquí.
¿En qué sentido son buenas condiciones?
Todo, la comida, todo, el comportamiento de los capataces y todo eso. ¿sí? Entonces uno busca donde vaya mejor, porque así.
Nosotros siempre pensamos en nuestros hijos, darles una calidad de vida a nuestros hijos, porque vivir en una finca así, que no es de uno propio, nos cuesta mucho.
So farmers value being treated well in general, but more specifically, they do talk a lot about food.
Y la comida, pues un poco regular, le da su mejora, aunque sea a las 12, pero se les da, mientras que en otros lugares, en otras fincas, hay diferencias porque no les dan nada, y entonces aquí sí se les ayuda un poquito. Sí.
Porque aquí les tienda bien, la dormida está buena, la comida está buena. Entonces hay otros lugares que no tienda bien a nosotros.
Ha dado más, nosotros le hicimos mejor el menú, pues en la semana y en la cocina se les ha cumplido más. Entonces ellos están contentos y dicen que van a regresar el próximo año.
Yo siento que ese es un apoyo grande, porque si a uno le falta el trabajo, le falta el alimento.
Second to food, people also talk a lot about the volume they're able to pick.
Pero como siempre es reconocida esta zona del norte de Jintea, que los cortes son buenos, entonces la mayoría de los cortadores están.
Cuando el café se le da buen mantenimiento, y entonces el rubro es mucho mejor, pues la producción eleva un porcentaje más de lo que puede cosechar el productor de café, porque la gente lo que quiere es ganar.
So accountability to millions of coffee farm workers like these is not easy, it's daunting. But we have some common interests. Let's look at this graph again. Again, second to food, the priority of farm workers is good plot conditions and productivity of coffee farms, the amount they're able to pick. And we should note this because it's squarely within our sphere of interest as well. So it gives us a place to start, perhaps. We should not expect or be expected to address labor in all of our supply chains simultaneously. But we should expect to begin. We have resources at our disposal. We have communication, technology, relationships, a burgeoning understanding of farm workers, and the ability to communicate more than we ever have before. And with those tools, we should start, because we are no longer able to count on unknowing what we now know. You know? So finally, I'd like the last voice you hear in this segment to come from a coffee farm worker.
¿Es suficiente lo que gana el trabajador?
No. No. Ni cerca, porque yo les decía que en los estados una taza de café vale más que un día de un trabajador aquí. Sí, y les decía yo que así como ellos no saben que si el café solo se vendió y ya, tampoco los de allá no saben que quién corta el café, que lo compran, se lo toman y ya. También ellos no tienen esa experiencia.
Thank you.